Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us. We're going to get started in less than a minute. Thank you for joining us for this important conversation about our community's views and priorities, particularly as they pertain to immigration and the economy. Okay, so in the interest of time, we will get started. We are excited to welcome Assemblymember Alex Lee today, who will offer some opening remarks to provide context about why these topics are so important for our communities. I'll just say a brief word or two about Assemblymember Lee. Alex Lee represents California's 24th Assembly District, which includes the Alameda County communities of Fremont, Newark, and Sonal, and the Santa Clara County communities of Milpitas and San Jose. Any of you who know Asian American Pacific Islander communities know that these are areas of heavy concentrations of diverse AAPI communities. Assemblymember Lee was elected in 2020 and became the youngest Asian American legislator ever elected and the first openly bisexual state legislator in California history. He currently serves as chair of the Committee on Human Services, the Select Committee on Social Housing, and the Legislative Progressive Caucus. Assemblymember Lee, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me here, and I am excited to kick off this event. Hey everyone, as Karthik said, I'm Assemblymember Alex Lee, representing Assembly District 24, which covers Santa Clara and Alameda County. For far too long, AAPI voices have been aggregated into a single category, undersampled or excluded altogether, and misrepresented in mainstream narratives. I represent the largest Asian majority district in California, where about 60% of all my constituents are Asian American, and immigration is a multifaceted issue in the AAPI communities. We have recent immigrants navigating legal systems, mixed status families, and long-established communities shaped by past policies and experience going over a century. In addition, API communities are often stereotyped as economically successful, but often there is data that reveals a deep inequality. For example, there may be significant income gaps between subgroups and high rates of poverty in certain communities. Some key issues I've worked on include cost of living and housing affordability, access to fresh and healthy food for everyone, small business assistance in ADA compliance, which is a challenge for especially English challenged communities, and wage disparities and labor protections. AAPI Data's recent survey shows that Trump's immigration policies are not popular among AAPI adults, and that AAPI adults are more unlikely to have favorable views of ICE. This is why I've introduced legislation to eliminate tax breaks for ICE contractors. The No Tax Breaks for ICE Contractors Act ensures that California does not subsidize corporations that enable ICE's reign of terror, instead directing public investments in communities ripped apart by ICE. Not a single dime of taxpayer dollars should be used to prop up these corporations that aid and abet ICE. In addition, other anti-ICE bills that have been introduced in the state assembly that will probably be part of a larger anti-ICE package include AB 1537 by Assemblymember Bryan that prohibits peace officers from also moonlighting for ICE, AB 1633, which imposes a 50% tax on profits earned by private immigration detention facilities, 7 of which are located, unfortunately, in California. AB 1650 by Senator Colosa, which prohibits rental car companies from renting cars to ICE, and AB 1896 Gonzalez and Speaker Rivas disqualify anyone employed by ICE from working a public sector job in the future. And lastly, AB 1627 bans former ICE agents from serving as police officers or teachers in California. And as chair of the California Legislative Progressive Caucus, we're also advocating for immigrants through increased healthcare investments and money for the Immigrant Council Access Pilot Program to provide legal support and services for immigrants. As you engage in this webinar today, I would like to emphasize that immigration and economic policy can't be done as an umbrella policy that treats API community as a monolith. It is so important to dissect the integral history of our success in this country and making the country a success itself with a vibrant and robust immigration system. And today, the data really shows that it's quite clear that folks really want a functioning system that actually processes immigration as a system of rules, not one that is enforced by handcuffs and guns. And I really appreciate again API Data putting this together and releasing a really comprehensive data to understand our community better and for the rest of the world to understand our communities better. So I appreciate it again. Thank you so much for having me on here. I look forward to hearing from the rest of the webinar. Thank you, Karthik.
Thank you, Assemblymember Lee, and especially for your leadership and for others. Right now, we're seeing major debates and really a stalemate in Washington, D.C. in terms of holding ICE accountable and really cutting back on many of the egregious actions that they've taken. Um, and heartening to see that there can be other prices to pay for people who violate due process, who violate basic rights. How likely do you see the passage for many of these? Do you see this as a favorable climate, especially with our governor and a gubernatorial race underway? Would love to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I'm highly optimistic that this package of bills are going to be passed. Very late last year, we passed the No Secret Police Act, which has had its legal challenges in the courts and such. The courts are, stacked in the federal administration's favor right now. But I do see a lot of strong passage support here, and then we'll probably fight it out in the courts with our attorney general to uphold our own laws. But I expect the federal government to fight back. I expect the ICE allies to fight back. But I do think that, and I'm optimistic that we will pass the legislation.
Finally, I want to ask you about housing. You chair the Select Committee
Okay.
on Social Housing. Housing, that has emerged as a major source of financial stress for our communities. What are the kinds of solutions we need in order to make sure that we have more access to affordable housing for our communities?
Yeah, absolutely. In the state legislature, we're prioritizing fast tracking and producing more affordable housing so all Californians can have that Californian dream. At the same time, I'm working on things like the Social Housing Act that many of our constituents are quite familiar with in the home countries where the government has a much more proactive job at providing affordable housing as a human right, as infrastructure, just like we do in America with our waterways, our schools and our roads and our libraries. Many Asian countries and European countries take a very proactive role in the provision of social housing that's publicly developed mixed income housing. And so I've also been pioneering that work for the last 6 years as chair of the Select Committee on Social Housing. And among the many efforts we're trying to do is get more financing for affordable housing, producing more affordable housing, but also making sure that social housing remains as a public good option. And that's, of course, been quite challenging, but I think even in my constituency, many people are not surprised by that concept. In fact, they're kind of like, why do we not do that in America? So I think it's really important that we tie all these things together and produce more housing in the private sector, but also more housing in the public sector too.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Assignment Member. I know your constituents and the state of California know who you are, but with this national audience, we're so happy that you were able to join us and that we're able to better understand the kind of solutions you're championing. Thanks again.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Karthik. Thank you.
Of course. Okay, I'll turn it over now to Sarah Sidwani.
Great. Thank you, Karthik. And welcome again to everyone who's been joining. I see our numbers continue to rise. So I'm really excited to welcome everyone again today to this conversation, this month's Voices of AAPI Community Briefing with critical insights on timely policy issues impacting our nation. Before we get started, I, of course, want to thank all of our partners that come together to make this data possible and available to you all, from AAPI Data, APIAVote, Asian American Journalists Association, and NCAPA for today's briefing, as well as the Associated Press and NORC for their ongoing partnership to secure all of this data. The Voices of AAPI briefings are an incredibly important resource of data and insights for our communities. No doubt we will see that today in all of the data that we're about to release. And I'm thrilled to be welcoming our speakers today, which we'll hear from a little bit later. So I want to turn it back over to you, Karthik. I'd love to welcome our founder and executive director, who's going to start us off by reviewing the main findings of the surveys. And just for all of those who are part of this, make sure as you have questions that arise to use the Q&A function to put it in there. I'll be monitoring that throughout our hour together, and we'll make sure to try and get to as many questions as possible. Thanks so much. Karthik?
Great. Thank you, Sarah, and thank you, everybody. So we have a lot of different findings to share, but under the broad themes of immigration, economic issues, but we also have some additional information in terms of evaluations of the Trump administration. And we have data that has never been collected before on our communities and with our communities that we think that you will find useful, especially to correct any misperceptions that might exist in terms of where our communities stand. So let's go to the next slide. By the way, this survey has been published on our website. If you just go to apidata.com, you'll find it on the main page. We also have a handy resource called Voices of Community, where key findings from this survey, alongside findings from many other surveys that we've conducted in the last year. That's one of the major benefits of the work that we do in partnership with the Associated Press and NORC, but also other surveys that we've done with APIAVote and with NCAPA. You will see them grouped together by theme and by topic in that resource guide. So let's go to the next slide. Okay, so something new that we're doing now is to use these webinars to have a little bit more interactivity, but also to get a sense of where our webinar participants stand vis-a-vis the rest of Asian American and Pacific Islanders in our survey results. So we're going to have two different polls in rapid succession. So we hope as many of you will participate as we can. So let's start the poll. So this first poll question are some questions that will appear in a future survey. So we're really curious to see where our webinar participants stand on these topics vis-a-vis the rest of the community. So we'll give another 10 seconds. We have about half of our participants have logged in their responses already. Okay, so let's stop the poll and see the results. So the first question is something that we do have in this survey. It's something that we asked last year as well. And the kind of pessimism that our webinar respondents are expressing here in terms of young people having a better standard of living than their parents is something that is reflected more generally in our survey findings as well. The next two questions will be coming in a forthcoming survey. And we're seeing some pretty strong unfavorable, not unfavorable, but views that suggest major problems in America, right? Please indicate the extent to which you agree or disagree that the United States is still the best country for immigrants today. You see, the majority are either somewhat disagree or strongly disagree. The vast majority are. And if someone were thinking about immigrating to the United States, you would tell them to wait for a better time. And we have 58% strongly agreeing. So let's stop that share. And then we'll go to the next poll, which is on economic issues. Well, economic issues and actually, I should say Trump policy views. And we have results to share with you briefly, but we'd love to see where you stand on these issues so that you can compare where you stand to our communities more broadly. Okay, we'll give it another 10 seconds to log in your responses. Okay, so let's stop and screen share. Okay, so the vast majority, 98%, say that Donald Trump has gone too far when it comes to imposing new tariffs on other countries. In terms of putting new restrictions on who can enter the country, 97% say gone too far, 3% say been about right. And then finally, Donald Trump's response to using the US military to intervene in other countries, 98% got too far, 2% about right. Okay, so we'll move on to what the rest of Asian American and Pacific Islander America believe on these and other issues. So let's go to the next slide. So what I'll be presenting are results from a survey that were conducted in early February. And it was a national probability sample built on the Amplify AAPI panel, which offers nationally representative samples with in-language support, including in Mandarin, Cantonese, Vietnamese, and Korean. Just shy of 1,200 completes, and the overall margin of error is about plus or minus 5 points. And we will have disaggregated data available on our website immediately following the webinar. Let's go to the next slide. So here are some of the key findings. One, a majority of APIs think that Trump has gone too far in using the US military to intervene in foreign countries. Important thing to note, by the way, they're more likely than the general population to say this. Remember that this survey was conducted in early February, so this is before the current military action in Iran. It was after the raid in Venezuela, which by most accounts was relatively quick. And so that level of opposition, even in early February, after the action in Venezuela and before this war in Iran, gives you an indication of where our communities likely stand on the current war in Iran, which is to oppose the current actions of the US government in Iran. API adults are also more likely than the national average to hold unfavorable views of ICE. So 73% have unfavorable views compared to 60% of the general population. Important context here is that the survey was conducted in early February after the killings of Renee Good and Alex Preddy, as well as our communities, including a senior Hmong individual who was mistreated in the hands of ICE, or in the hands of immigration enforcement, I should say. And then finally, when it comes to whether Trump has gone too far, not far enough, or about right, 2/3 say that Trump has gone too far when it comes to deporting immigrants. And these findings are in line with the results that we found in August and September of 2025. Next slide. Now, when it comes to immigration, we ask questions about benefits as well as risks from both legal immigration as well as illegal immigration. And this is important to know where our communities stand. We also have comparisons to the rest of the US when the same set of questions was asked a few months ago. And we find that 75% of API adults that say that economic growth is a major benefit of legal immigration, but importantly, slightly above a majority say the same about illegal immigration as well. And importantly, they are more likely to see economic growth as a major benefit of illegal immigration than does the general population at 42%. Next slide. Finally, when it comes to economic issues, we find that cost of living is a large source of stress, with the cost of groceries, healthcare, and housing as major sources of stress. We also find that optimism for future generations is low, with less than a third, so just 29% of API adults thinks it is likely that young people today will have a better standard of living than their parents, and these results are slightly worse than when we asked the same question last year. Finally, a large number of API adults believe that Trump has contributed to the increased cost of living. Majority say that Trump has hurt rather than helped the cost of living, cost of healthcare, and job creation. So let's dive deeper into many of these findings. Next slide. So when it comes to views on the Trump administration, we have questions not only about Trump favorability, but also about Vance, Rubio, and Kennedy, as well as questions about Trump's performance on domestic issues, foreign policy, and immigration. So let's go to the next slide. So when it comes to favorability, we find that 72% of API adults have a very unfavorable or somewhat unfavorable view of Trump, and that's higher than the US average of 61. When looked by partisanship, the only community that holds a favorable view of Trump are API Republicans. J.D. Vance does not fare much better. About 2/3 hold unfavorable views of him, with 13% saying they don't know enough to say. RFK Jr. is also unpopular in our community. Close to 60% hold an unfavorable view of RFK Jr. And similarly, for Marco Rubio, 55% hold an unfavorable view, 21% favorable, and 24% say they don't know enough to say. Next slide. We also asked about favorability, not only about individuals, but also about agencies as well as the political parties. We see that ICE, API adults hold more unfavorable, are more likely to hold unfavorable views about ICE than the US average. And this is important to note because when mainstream media generally thinks about who opposes ICE, they might not be thinking about AAPIs as one of those communities who hold strongly negative views of this agency. On the other side, you see the Federal Reserve, generally favorable views, 50 to 27%. And some of that variation is due to parties, but not as strong of a partisan difference as you might expect. Finally, we see that APIs in general hold much more unfavorable views of the Republican Party than the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party does not do that well either, right? 49% unfavorable versus 44% favorable. So overall, this reflects a fairly dour mood in our communities of various types of institutions, including government institutions and party institutions. Next slide. Now, when it comes to opinion on ICE, you'll find the detailed tables when we have that up on our website at the conclusion of this webinar. But it's important here to note that Filipinos are less likely than the API average or the Asian American average to hold very unfavorable views of ICE. And this is in line with other findings. Now, I don't want to overemphasize this because if you add up the 51 plus 7, you still have 58% holding unfavorable views. But you see a pretty clear difference with other communities holding much more unfavorable views. We also find that Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders, I want to caution that the sample size is relatively small for NHPIs in this and other surveys that we've done with the Amplify panel. But the pattern is one that is consistent, where when it comes to immigration and a few other issues, you see more centrism and more conservatism among NHPIs than the overall average for our communities. Next slide. We also see major differences by age. So the highest unfavorability for ICE is among those age 18 to 34, but it's not positive among those age 65 plus. Again, it's really important for us to look at the evidence so that we don't rely on shorthand and somehow think or imply that older APIs hold favorable views of ICE. They do not. We also see partisanship as a major factor with the highest unfavorability ratings among Democrats. And with Republicans, more split, but at the very least, you see a majority of Republicans still holding favorable views of ICE as of early February 2026. Next slide. Now, in terms of Donald Trump's policies, we see, generally speaking, our communities think that Trump has gone too far in terms of imposing new tariffs on other countries, using the US military to intervene in other countries, deporting all immigrants, as well as putting new restrictions on who can enter the country legally. I should say deporting all immigrants living in the US illegally. So overall, when it comes to either foreign policy or immigration policy, you see widespread disapproval of the Trump administration's policy. Next slide. When it comes to military intervention, again, the caveat is that these questions were asked in February before the current war in Iran. You see the greatest opposition among those age 18 to 34, but you see significant opposition even among those in older age groups. The only group where we see favorable opinion on US military intervention in other countries is among AAPI Republicans. Among independents, you have over 2/3 who believe that Donald Trump has gone too far when it comes to using the US military to intervene in other countries. Next slide. Now, on other issues, including economic issues and cost of living issues, we see that the vast majority of APIs believe that Donald Trump has hurt rather than helped when it comes to creating jobs, when it comes to cost of living, when it comes to cost of healthcare. And you see that partisanship, again, plays a significant role, but I would draw attention to API independents who all hold negative views in terms of what Donald Trump has meant to various economic issues. Next slide. Digging deeper within our communities, you see that when it comes to cost of living and negative assessments of Donald Trump, we see the most negative assessments among those age 18 to 34, but still among older age groups. For example, among those 65 plus, 48% says that he has hurt a lot, 15% hurt a little, right? So well over a majority of API seniors believe that Donald Trump has hurt our communities when it comes to cost of living. Republicans, again, are the only group who hold more favorable views. Next slide. So next, we're going to dive deeper on immigration. Key takeaways, we've already seen that APIs hold more unfavorable views on ICE than the US average. Most think that Trump has gone too far on immigration enforcement. APIs generally hold more progressive views on immigration enforcement than the US average. And they also hold more favorable views than the US average on economic benefits from illegal as well as legal immigration. Next slide. So here you see a breakdown of where our communities stand, both by party ID, those are the bottom two rows, but also where we stand vis-a-vis the rest of the US population. So in terms of whether increasing security of the US border should be a high priority, API adults are much less likely than the US average to say yes. When it comes to allowing refugees to come to the US to escape violence in their home countries, it's a little bit lower, but it's within the margin of error. So this is something that's important to note. Even though refugee admissions has meant a lot for many Asian American communities, we don't see this as a high priority in our community at this point in time. Finally, when it comes to deporting immigrants living in the US illegally, only 22% of APIs say that this should be a high priority compared to a third of US adults. Next slide. Now, when it comes to various heavy-handed tactics on immigration enforcement, the results here are about in line with what we saw in August and September of last year. So what that says to me is that while Minnesota certainly raised the salience of this issue in news coverage and in our communities, you don't actually see that much worsening of opinion when it comes to many of these factors. And Los Angeles likely played a significant role in terms of raising alarm on these issues in our communities. So you see significant opposition on using the military and National Guard on immigration enforcement, conducting large-scale ICE operations, these roving patrols in high immigrant neighborhoods with high immigrant populations, allowing immigrant enforcement agents to cover their faces when arresting people, and also arresting immigrants who are in the country illegally while they're at their job. Next slide. Finally, we'll talk about benefits from immigration as well as risks. API adults are more likely than the US average to see economic benefits from legal immigration. This is important because this has now become a contentious topic, not only on the right, but also in Congress, where you have seen various attempts to try to cut back on legal immigration. And you also have seen the Trump administration enact various policies to cut back on legal immigration, either through student visas or through the H-1B program. Next slide. not only do APIs see economic benefits from legal immigration, they also see it from illegal immigration, and much more so than the US average. This is important because standard narratives would suggest that Asian Americans in particular would be more likely to hold the good immigrant, bad immigrant kind of distinction and to not see economic benefits from illegal immigration. But we see that, for example, 58% say that there's a major benefit to the economy because when immigrants come illegally to the United States, they take jobs that Americans don't want, or they contribute to economic growth. So you see a more positive assessment on the economic contribution of immigrants, regardless of their legal status among APIs vis-a-vis the US adult population. Let's go to the next slide. So there are some areas where we see APIs saying that there are some risks of immigrants entering the country illegally, but those risks are lower than the US average, right? So saying that welfare and safety net programs will be burdened, 38% see that as a major risk in our community compared to 50% for the US overall. In terms of committing crimes in the US, 31% in our community versus 37% among US adults see that as a major risk. So you can see the rest of the comparisons here. So generally speaking, our communities are less likely to see those major risks, but certainly there are, from a fifth to upwards of a third of our community, depending on the way the question is asked, who do see risks, social risks, including those related to welfare and safety, as well as crimes. Next slide. Finally, on economic issues, cost of groceries, housing, and healthcare are major sources of economic stress. Economic confidence has not improved since last year. Most consider their personal financial situation as holding steady, and APIs are pessimistic about the economic outlook for younger generations. So let's go to the next slide. So I'll go through these fairly quickly so that we can hear from our panelists. So when it comes to major sources of stress, we see the cost of groceries, housing, and healthcare essentially tied, with a majority of API adults saying that these are major sources of stress. On par with the US average, although when it comes to housing and healthcare, you see slightly elevated levels of stress and concern in our community. Let's go to the next slide. In terms of confidence about their current economic situation, we see that our community is slightly worse than it was in April of last year in terms of being able to keep up with expenses or paying for an unexpected unexpected medical expense, it's on par, but in terms of generally keeping up with expenses, you see a slight degradation, and it's on par with the US average. Let's go to the next slide. So when it comes to optimism about future generations being better off than current generations, we see pessimism now as we saw before. And in fact, the situation is slightly worse in February 2026, 29% compared to 34% in April 2025, saying that it is very likely or somewhat likely that younger generations will have a better standard of living than their parents. Next slide. In terms of the current financial situation, overall, you see most communities saying that they're holding steady, but those aged 35 to 49 is worth watching. And you'll see that in another finding as well. But they are more likely than those in other age groups to say that they're falling behind. Next slide. We also had questions about ownership for the first time ever. And in the report, you will see how the economic outlook and economic anxiety relate to ownership of different types of assets. And we'll just go in deeper into a couple of them here. One, when it comes to ownership of various retirement plans, you see variation by ethnicity and race here. So Pacific Islanders less likely to have retirement plans such as a 401k or an IRA. And similarly, you see Filipinos less likely than other groups like Chinese or Japanese Americans to have retirement plans. Let's go to the next slide. In terms of cost of healthcare as a source of stress, not much variation here, but it is interesting to see that among Asian Indians who tend to have, on average, the highest incomes and highest educational attainment in our communities, to see the cost of healthcare as a major source of stress in the Indian American community. Let's go to the next slide. We see that healthcare is a major source of stress across the board, slightly more so among women than among men, but by age, we see this concern elevated across the board. I'd also draw attention to independents. So 60% of independents say that the cost of healthcare is a major source of stress. Let's go to the next slide. Finally, when it comes to housing, we see variation here, but here I would draw attention to Filipinos and Vietnamese, indicating that the cost of housing is a major source of stress, 61% of Vietnamese and 56% of Filipinos. We also see Pacific Islanders, 60%, who say that the cost of housing is a major source of stress. Next slide. And then finally, when we look by gender, age, and party ID, we don't see much variation by party ID, although independents are slightly more likely than those who are Democrat and Republican to say that cost of housing is a major source of stress. And again, here, remember that 35 to 49 group. You see in terms of cost of housing is a major source of stress among them, as well as those in the 18 to 34 age range. Next slide. So there we are. Those are a bunch of findings on, generally speaking, on Trump administration's performance, as well as immigration, as well as various economic issues. Back to you, Sarah.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Karthik. This survey just contains so much fascinating data on so many topics. I can't wait to jump in. Let me introduce first, however, some of our guests who have joined us today. We have Joanne Panio, the Policy Director for NCAPA, the National Council of Asian Pacific Americans, and Sang Lee, the National Field Director for APIAVote. Let's start off talking a little bit about some of these findings on immigration. I'd love to dive a little bit deeper into this topic with both of you. Sang, you are joining us from Minnesota. Immigration, of course, has been a prominent issue in Minnesota. Of course, the area has been really ground zero to so many of the immigration enforcement actions that we have seen, and that no doubt we're driving a lot of this data was on the minds of folks. Tell us a little bit about what you're seeing from the ground, and what are some of your initial takeaways when you see this data?
Yeah, I thank API Data for having APIAVote here to talk, especially about this issue. It's like the data suggests, overwhelmingly, APIs do not support the ICE tactics that were used here in Minnesota, especially how broadly it was broadcasted and the amount of brutality and violence that was used on individuals. What's happened is you've seen, and Karthik had mentioned this too, is the prime example was Trump Scott Lee. Trump Scott Tao, who was wrongly arrested and pulled out of his house by immigration enforcement in the middle of winter, right? While his grandkids were actually watching, and he was in underwear. If you saw those photos, it's shocking. And in the end, he wasn't even the person that was. He was the wrong person that they were looking for. So all of that really has sparked conversations within the community to really question sort of the oh shit moment, in that this could be us, right? Like, it's not just them coming after bad guys the way as immigration services has portrayed it to be. So I think those are very raw sort of sentiments right now that's happening locally here. In terms of our partners too, they're working on new trainings and also prepping for the November election as we're heading towards that, in case people are fearful of showing up the polls or any sort of law enforcement intimidation at the same time too. So those are things that what we're seeing and hopefully trying to address. And I'll also add on the immigration part, even though like there's this large national coverage about all of what's going on in Minnesota and some of the horrendous things, but at the end, on the grounds, we saw the neighbors coming together to really organize themselves to help bring food to families, and also simply taking their, like helping take kids to school, right? I mean, these things are it's not shown in the data, but it's also really important to consider about at the same time. But overall, that our community is really second, like sort of thinking again, rethinking about their position on immigration itself.
Yeah, and that's such a hopeful sort of message, really, that in despite these incredibly hard times that people are living through, that you see communities coming together to support one another. And I think you made this really great point, linking it to the upcoming election as well. I mean, we've certainly seen in the past that when communities feel threatened, particularly when the AAPI community feels this sense of threat, that it leads to mobilization. And I'm super curious to see how that all plays out in this election year. Joanne, I'd love to bring you into this conversation as well. Coming from the NCAPA perspective, how do you translate these findings into some concrete policy advocacy on the Hill or even with federal agencies?
Thank you, Sarah, and thanks to Karthik and our friends at API Data for today's briefing. You know, I think it's very telling to see that most folks believe that Trump's gone too far in immigration. We're now year 2 into this administration, and within this timeline, we've seen a mass and violent deportation campaign carried out on the streets, in schools, in places of worship, at the airport, at home, and a heavily funded enforcement agency that's been running rampant and without guardrails. So in terms of our advocacy, when it comes to congressional advocacy, we have engaged in federal appropriations and making sure that we're working towards seeing federal dollars go into the actual programs and services that reach and support our communities, while also trying to ensure that there are guardrails and protections from a rogue agency such as ICE. Every year, NCAPA does organize around our coalition to ensure that we are amplifying across different issue areas for funding, such as supporting multilingual students in education, public health research, housing counseling, and others. And in terms of immigration programs this year and what we've been advocating for in terms of policies, we've advocated for ensuring that refugees are protected from immigration enforcement, that there are reports based on prolonged detentions that are being submitted, that the federal government informs Congress of which countries are participating in third country removal, so some of those agencies that we just noted, and making sure that COFA citizens of the Compacts of Free Association, are able to live, study, and work within the continental US without this fear of being deported, which we know has been happening. In terms of administrative advocacy, I'll say, very early on last year, our coalition had been thinking about calling out the pending nomination at that time of the incoming Secretary of Homeland Security. So we did, because of the problematic rhetoric and actions that she had conducted while in office. And then most recently, we've also supported efforts in opposition to Senator Mullen's nomination, which we know has been confirmed this week. So we'll continue to do our part in terms of advocacy, working on those fronts and in other ways to ensure that transparency, accountability is taking place, and that we are pushing for resources to reach our communities.
It's such incredible work that you're doing, and certainly, as we can see from this data, reflective of the deepest concerns of the API community. I just want to remind all of our guests today that you too can ask questions. Use that Q&A function down at the bottom of your screen, and we'll be keeping an eye on that and try to pull in some of those questions. I want to move on to economics, but before we do so, Karthik, any additional thoughts that you want to add on the immigration topic?
Yeah, I just want to add, and even though we're focusing a lot on immigration enforcement and ICE, I think it's important to also look at the data on both legal immigration as well as illegal immigration and those attitudes. What we've seen is a significant decline in favorable opinion on legal immigration among the general US population. But our communities, because a lot of them come through routes like family sponsorship and economic sponsorship, know the realities to be different. So I think it's important to kind of point that out. And that's an important part of the policy battles being fought right now, including on H-1Bs, including on international student visas, and the like. And then also on undocumented immigration or illegal immigration, regardless of the words that are being used, to me, it was eye-opening to see that our communities continue to see economic benefits. Again, probably a more reality-based view of what the US economy relies on rather than being swayed by ideological arguments that are, you know, more partisan fueled than based on the economic realities.
Yeah, I mean, that's such a great point, especially in this era and moment where there's so much misinformation being spread, to see that communities are it appears that there's cutting through that. And despite a lot of the information that's out there, developing the opinions that we maybe wouldn't have otherwise expected. To this point, Alex, in the Q&A also talked a little bit about, how do we come up with this, a law that would counteract that age-old Chinese Exclusion Act and really be thinking about Asian inclusion as a part of our future. And I think that's absolutely kind of the work that it sounds like so many of you are doing.
Yeah, I mean, quick thing I'll say on that is ideally, and many people may not realize this, and it all hinges on whether you call something a quota or a cap. To the casual observer, those would be one and the same, right? But what happened in 1965 is that the US abolished quotas, restrictive quotas per country, but we still have per country caps. So what that means is that if you're trying to sponsor a Filipino relative or an Indian relative or a Chinese relative, it might take not only years, but decades. Last time I checked, it was over 20 years for certain family visa categories of Filipinos. So that's something that if we at least loosen that, by the way, if you're trying to sponsor a family member from the United Kingdom or Ireland, it would be much lower, right? So there's still an amount of social engineering that is built into our law on immigration and sponsorship. So that is a potential area of reform. That might not happen right away. It seems quite unlikely that it would, but there are definitely injustices and inequities that are built in to the 1965 law, which we generally see as lifting some of the worst restrictions on immigration from Asian countries.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, long before I was in the ivory tower, I was in the immigrant rights advocacy world, and we were even then 20 years ago working on family immigration and looking at the ways to ease that long backlog. I want to switch gears just a little bit. I'm sure we could talk immigration the entire time, but we have so many other topics that were covered in this survey data. The data shows that Americans are clearly feeling economic stress around cost of living and affordability. I'm curious to learn a little bit more about each of how each of you see economic stress playing out in our communities. Joanne, maybe let's start with you. 8 in 10 API adults say that the cost of groceries, housing, and healthcare are sources of stress. Healthcare in particular has been cited as a consistent source of financial anxiety in this poll, but also in others, right? This isn't the first time that we're seeing this. What policy interventions could we advocate for to restore the belief that APIs can thrive and have a thriving future in the United States? Where is NCAPA on some of this work?
Thank you, Sarah, for that question. Not surprising to see that cost of living is top of mind for so many folks across our communities, especially when it comes to healthcare. I think when you've got gas prices going up, the average right now is, I believe, $3.98 per gallon, just 20 cents more than it was 2 weeks ago, and grocery prices staying up. It's really hard not to think about how can folks travel? How can folks get to work? How can we put food on the table when we're trying to feed our families? And as we think about affordability and opportunity more broadly, I also wanted to raise the changes that are also happening in terms of access to student loans, since there was that polling question earlier on sources of economic stress covering student debt. Thanks to API Data's data, we know that over 1.3 million Asian American and 111,000 Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander students who are pursuing their undergraduate studies are on financial aid, right? So with the policy changes that are happening on that front, from caps on how much students and their families can borrow and no exceptions for forbearance during instances of unemployment or even economic hardship, policy decisions that are being made here in DC are having a real and negative impact on everyday people on a number of fronts. When we think of financial stress and affordability, Studies have shown that Trump's first year reflected slower job creation and rising unemployment rates, which ties back to that 62% of ANHPIs believing he's hurt job creation overall. Also touching upon the impacts of the tariff policies that have also jumped in prices on everyday items. So not surprising to see that a good portion of our communities disapprove of Trump's economic policies. When we think of the things that we get at the grocery store, beef, poultry, fish, eggs, they've gone up. Canned goods, because of the tariffs on aluminum, have also jumped up. Housing, wanted to cover that also real briefly. Rent's gone up, energy costs are higher, electricity is 6% higher than it was in the past, with the average electricity bill now being about $110 higher than it was, and more, of course, in specific states when you consider some of those denser states. Owning a house appears further and further out of reach for so many in the US. Foreclosures are now 20% higher than they were last year, signaling that more and more families are struggling to keep up with mortgage payments as costs rise. I did want to make a plug on this topic of housing affordability, our fantastic partners at National Capacity and their great report that outlines the economic realities of ANHPIs and advocates for ensuring that poverty measurements are accurate, investing in the preservation and development of affordable housing in some of those high cost metropolitan areas where a majority of ANHPIs live, and some others. And so for folks who are interested in housing policy and might have some curiosities, I'll be sure to drop that link to the chat momentarily. But to your point on access to affordable healthcare being such a real challenge for folks, I think what we should be advocating for is renewing the ACA. Right? I think this is a reminder for folks that the ACA subsidies that expired back in December still have yet to be revisited by members of Congress as a priority. And since December, premiums have skyrocketed. So there's been a jump in co-payments and deductibles, and ACA enrollment has dropped nationally by more than 1 million. And just for context, what does this look like in terms of everyday costs for a couple or for a family? Consider a household of 2 adults with an annual income of about $30,000 a year. Their premiums from what was $162 per month in 2025 has now jumped to $483 per month this year. That's an increased expense of almost, $6,000 in 1 year. That could go towards some of the things that we've already named that have jumped in price: rent, gas, other essential needs. So to restore that belief that APIs can have a thriving future in the US, advocating for making sure that our overall health and well-being is there by pushing for healthcare being affordable, such as renewing the ACAs. There should be more educational and job opportunities to ensure stability and to promote socioeconomic mobility. And the immediate making sure that those costs and some of those everyday items are going down are some of the things I think we would be continuing to push for as we inform our coalition members and community partners.
Certainly a lot of work to be done in that regard. I want to be cautious of time, but I want to bring you in to hear a little bit about your view from the field on these economic hardships that folks are feeling.
I think that one of the key things, even having learned from the last presidential election, is by all metrics of like the economy, our economy is doing good. But I think really the feeling of how things are good or not good is really important to mobilize voters. And that feeling is sometimes more important than anything else in terms of trying to convince people by the metrics of success, right? And I think that we saw that, like, if you feel like the economy doesn't work in a particular way, you vote in a particular way, because like that's part of it. And what we're seeing throughout all the states is, yes, affordability and the economy is one of the biggest factors that's going to help drive more voters into action just this coming year. And the Iran war doesn't help at the same time, right? We just saw this last year in Georgia. A very obscure election, the Public Service Commission. Very few people even know about that, but Georgia's Public Service Commission is a commission of electeds that regulate the utilities. Right, they had historic turnout for that race, for statewide race. That's unheard of, right? But what we've heard from partners and people on the ground is like they're just talking to people with utilities, and these things are impacting voters directly. It wasn't partisan-based issues that was being conveyed. It was just look at your utility bills, like ask if that's right or wrong, and how do you particularly feel about that. So that's a great indicator in how I believe that this next election is going to come down to is the feeling in which how the economy is really going to be affecting it. Because, like I said, we have proof from the last previous election on this race that really shows that, right? And we also see, like, with AI and the stress that's giving folks of a job loss, but also this promise that building out data centers is also going to bring jobs to particular regions of the Midwest, like Wisconsin, right? There's huge backlashes within rural Wisconsin with voters about the construction of these AI data centers that promises economic boom, but doesn't really, right? I think these things are still ongoing in places like Wisconsin. That's going to affect the electorate in terms of how the economy is going to play into and factor into this coming year's midterm election, because it's movement that I think, like I said at the beginning, it comes, we can prove all we want on the metric itself, which is really important, but it's going to come down to how voters are actually feeling on the ground in terms of, are they better off now than where they than a year or 3 years ago?
Yes, that's sorry about that. Absolutely. And I think when I think of all of this economic stress that we're talking about, absolutely, I would imagine that is contributing to this real concern and lack of optimism about, for future generations. From the survey, we found that just 29% of AAPI adults think it's likely that young people today will have a better standard of living than their parents. Saying, in the couple minutes that we have left, I'd love to hear from all three of you if we can fit it in. Do you think this pessimism is going to translate into voter apathy? Or do you think that this pessimism might actually fuel some mobilization as we're moving towards those midterm elections, as you were just kind of laying out?
There's going to be a lot of pessimism, and I think so too. I think it's hard being a young person in this time. That's why there's the definition of which party that they are aligned with is sort of in flux at the moment. But I also, my biggest fear with that pessimism and that apathy is the inability to mobilize, or the energy to mobilize. I think both parties rely on a lot of young people to have that energy to do civic engagement, to engage with voters. And my biggest concern or risk is that if this continues, we might lose that part. But also at the same time, I am young people are real resilient, and I believe they'll figure something out.
Absolutely true on that point for sure. Joanne, thoughts on the lack of optimism here?
Thanks, Sarah. And, agreeing in terms of the pessimism and voter apathy here, this notion, this belief, I think really does tie to how we see ourselves as belonging in America, and also have a fair and fighting chance to succeed in America through things like equitable access to education, job opportunities, affordable housing, and making sure that we are healthy and well. I think this ties to the policy changes that our members are witnessing in terms of who is seen as welcome in America. So tying back to some of those immigration policies that we spoke of earlier, and how there are fewer resources and opportunities for our communities at large. That being said, I think now's the time for us to mobilize, right? Not saying how folks should vote, but there's a sense of, hey, this is not what we signed up for, let alone voted for in terms of the state of our country. We deserve better. We deserve every opportunity because we too belong here. And belonging means that we deserve to be represented because we are those constituents of elected officials, and we expect that they're fighting for our best interests as constituents and not just the interests of their own pockets. So I think as we continue to think about the future and making sure that pessimism and voter apathy is something that we are aware of and considering, just making sure that folks understand that our unique experiences as ANHPIs have a place in history and that we are a part of this country's future.
Yeah, absolutely. I can't wait to see where young people go with their mobilization, especially when we see those numbers around the level of pessimism, not only amongst Republicans, but also amongst the Democratic Party as well. We are just about at time. Karthik, do you have any final words of wisdom for us before we sign up?
Well, I just saw someone type something in the chat rather than Q&A. People asked about the midterms and what trends they're seeing. I mean, what I would say is, midterm elections tend to be lower turnout affairs, and our communities tend to do disproportionately worse in those, and young people especially. That said, 2018, we saw significant turnout, record levels of turnout for midterm elections for our communities and for young people in general. Will we see that again? If you look at 2018, right? I mean, Trump was not on the ballot, but that was seen as a resounding rejection and referendum on him. But Trump has the ability to mobilize his base as well. So it'll still be a base mobilization election. But I do, with saying I do see the concern about, I don't know if it's apathy, but maybe disillusionment. When you have an administration that ran on the cost of living as kind of the major agenda item and is engaging in policies that are driving up the cost of energy and making good jobs less likely, I don't know where that energy goes. I don't know if people say, okay, switch to the other side, or just like, I just give up. I don't even know who can address our needs and interests anymore. So I think that risk of demobilization is quite high, especially in a midterm election year. And then you add on top of that all of the restrictions that have already occurred or that are being planned, including potentially sending ICE agents to polling locations, right? So it's going to be a very contentious election, but I hope that our communities, especially when it comes to the need and the importance of exercising our civic voice, that we stay strong.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's right. And I'll just add to that list also all of the redistricting that has occurred over just in the last year could also put some dampening effects on the kind of response that we see, especially when comparing it to 2018. That's all we have time for today. I want to thank everyone for joining us. Thanks for your engagement and participation in today's briefing. We come to you once every 2 months with updated information, so we hope you can join us again in the future. Continue to stay up to date on all of the latest findings at AAPI Data and the AP-NORC websites. And as always, feel free to reach out with any questions. Thank you so much to our panelists for joining us today, Sang Lee and Joanne Panio, and of course to Karthik Ramakrishnan for sharing all of this incredible data. Thanks, everybody.